Have you ever noticed that some of the calmest, most grounded people you meet often walk through life alone? They don't post about big friend groups. They don't chase invitations or fill their weekends with endless gatherings. Yet somehow there's something magnetic about them. A quiet confidence, a sense of peace that feels almost untouchable. In today's world where social media accounts and friend lists have become symbols of success, loneliness can seem like failure. We scroll through feeds filled with smiling faces and think, maybe I'm missing something. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if being alone doesn't mean being unloved, but being aligned? This isn't about pity or judgment. It's about understanding. Because people who don't have friends or have just a few often share 5 extraordinary personality traits, qualities that most of the world overlooks, but that reveal rare strength and depth of character. And when you start to recognize these traits in yourself, you may begin to see solitude in a completely different light. Let's explore these 5 remarkable qualities, beginning with the first one, the one that lies at the heart of every true independent soul. The first trait that often defines people who don't have many friends is authenticity. They don't shapeshift to fit into groups or pretend to like what everyone else likes just to belong. They live by their values, even when it costs them popularity. I once met an older gentleman named Richard at a small cafe in Vermont. He was in his 70s, living alone after losing his wife years earlier. When I asked if he ever felt lonely, he smiled and said that he missed good conversation sometimes, but he didn't miss pretending. That answer stayed with me. Richard explained how, for most of his life, he felt pressured to say yes to family events, to work parties, to people he didn't truly connect with. But the older he got, the more he realized that being genuine was worth more than being liked. When you're young, you think fitting in gives you safety. But when you're older, you realize that honesty gives you peace. And that's what authenticity really is. Peace with yourself. Most people today bend constantly under social pressure. They wear different faces depending on who they're with, terrified of disapproval. But people who have few friends, they've chosen a different path. They'd rather walk alone in truth than walk with a crowd built on false approval. Authenticity takes courage. It's easy to agree with everyone. It's easy to laugh at jokes you don't find funny, to stay silent when something feels wrong, or to nod along just to keep the peace. But those who value authenticity can't do that. They may lose company, but they gain self-respect. You can see it in the way they dress, the way they talk, the small details of how they live. Their homes reflect their taste, not trends. Their conversations are honest, sometimes blunt, but never hollow. They don't flatter to win affection, and they don't exaggerate to impress. In a way, authenticity filters life. It naturally reduces the number of people around you because not everyone can handle honesty. Some will walk away when you stop pretending, but that's not loss. It's clarity. And when you think about it, some of history's most remarkable people were like that. Think of Albert Einstein, who preferred quiet study to socializing, or Jane Austen, who spent most of her time observing society from the outside rather than joining it. They didn't crave attention. They followed what felt true. So if you ever feel like you don't fit into the noise of modern life, remember this. Authenticity doesn't isolate you. It protects you. It's what allows you to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that you are living your life, not someone else's script. And from authenticity comes another quality that makes solitude not just bearable, but beautiful. The second trait is independence. In a world addicted to validation, independence has become almost a rebellion. Look around. People can't even go for a walk without posting about it. They need likes to feel seen, messages to feel wanted, constant contact to feel safe. But those who can be alone without anxiety, they hold a kind of freedom that's almost sacred. Independence isn't just about living alone or making your own decisions. It's about emotional stability. It's about not needing others to complete you, but choosing people who complement you. Take, for example, Emma, a woman in her early 60s I once interviewed for a senior living project. After retiring, she realized that most of her friends were actually just colleagues. They stopped calling once the office disappeared. For a while, she felt abandoned, until she decided to travel alone. Her first solo trip was to Scotland. She told me how terrifying it felt, sitting at an airport cafe, watching groups of travelers laughing together while she sat quietly with her tea. But by the third day of her trip, something shifted. She started enjoying her own company, choosing museums she wanted to visit, eating where she wanted to eat, moving at her own rhythm. For the first time in her life, she felt like her happiness was entirely in her hands. That's independence. When your emotional state is no longer held hostage by the attention or approval of others. Many people fill their calendars because they fear silence. They need constant distraction because when everything stops, they're forced to face themselves. Independent people aren't afraid of that. They know that silence isn't emptiness. It's a mirror. It reflects who they really are, and they have the courage to look. Being independent also means taking responsibility. It's realizing that waiting for someone else to fix your life is a waste of time. Independent people make their own decisions, solve their own problems, and accept their own mistakes. They might fall, but they always stand back up on their own feet. And that strength doesn't make them cold or detached. In fact, it makes them capable of deeper love because they don't depend on others to fill their emotional gaps. They give love freely, not out of need, but from abundance. I remember hearing a story about an old sailor who lived alone by the coast. Every morning, he'd walk along the beach, fixing old fishing nets, whistling softly to himself. When asked why he never remarried after his wife passed, he replied that he wasn't lonely. He was full. That kind of inner fullness, that's independence. And when you develop it, you start to see relationships differently. You no longer look for people to rescue you. You look for people who grow with you. You stop begging for attention and start building peace. And as that inner strength grows, another quality begins to form. One that explains why some people keep their social circle small, even when they could have many friends. The third trait is selectivity. One of the most misunderstood things about people with few friends is that they're often not antisocial. They're selective. They value connections so deeply that they refuse to settle for anything shallow. It's like how a master craftsman treats his tools, carefully, deliberately, with attention to quality. In relationships, selectivity works the same way. These people don't collect acquaintances, they curate bonds. To them, friendship isn't about quantity, it's about resonance. It's not about how many people show up at your birthday, but about who shows up when life falls apart. I once knew a woman named Clara who had been through a rough divorce. During that time, most of her so-called friends disappeared. Only two people stayed, a neighbor who brought her soup every few days, and an old colleague who would quietly check in. Years later, Clara said something that defined her whole approach to relationships. She stopped confusing company with connection. After that, she chose her circle carefully. She no longer attended every dinner or replied to every message out of obligation. Her friendships became fewer but stronger, built on honesty, not convenience. That's what selectivity is. The wisdom to know who adds to your life and who only takes from it. Many people keep toxic or draining friendships simply because they're afraid of being alone. They tolerate gossip, disrespect, and one-sided relationships just to avoid that empty feeling. But those who understand the value of solitude don't make that trade. They'd rather walk alone in peace than sit surrounded by people who don't truly see them. And that's not arrogance. It's self-protection. It's knowing your worth. Being selective doesn't mean closing your heart. It means opening it carefully. Because once you've experienced false friendship, you learn to listen for sincerity. You notice who asks how you are and actually waits for the answer. The truth is, people who have few friends often have sharper instincts. They can sense when a connection is genuine and when it's built on convenience or manipulation. That intuition develops from experience, from years of learning that not everyone who smiles at you has your best interests at heart. They no longer chase approval because they've learned that peace is more valuable than popularity. A man named Luis once told me something that captures this perfectly. He said, "I used to try to be everyone's friend until I realized that not everyone deserves access to my peace." After years of disappointments, he decided to treat his time and attention like a treasure, something given, not owed. And that mindset changed everything. He stopped feeling drained after social gatherings. He stopped forcing small talk. The few friendships he kept were rooted in loyalty and mutual respect. People like Luis don't shut the world out. they simply filter it. They understand that having one or two genuine friends, those who truly listen, who encourage growth, who show up without needing an invitation, is worth more than a crowd that only knows how to take. They treat their social circle like a garden, small, carefully tended, and full of people who help them bloom. And because of this deep discernment, these individuals often develop another rare and precious quality: introspection. When you spend more time alone, something profound happens. You begin to turn inward. You start exploring the landscape of your own mind, your memories, your mistakes, your emotions, your values. You learn to understand yourself in ways that many people never do because they are too busy running from their own thoughts. Introspection is not sadness. It's not isolation. It's awareness. It's like sitting quietly by a lake and realizing that the stillness allows you to finally see your reflection clearly. I once met a retired professor named Helen who lived alone in a small cottage filled with books and journals. Every morning, she would sit by her window with a cup of tea and write reflections about her day before. When I asked why she did that, she said, "It helps me keep track of who I'm becoming." She explained that we often assume we stay the same over time, but we don't. We evolve, and unless we stop to look inward, we might not notice how far we've come. That's the gift of introspection. It gives you a map of your inner world. While others look for validation outside, introspective people look within. They notice their emotional patterns, their triggers, their strengths, and their fears. And by understanding themselves, they become better at understanding others. It's no coincidence that many great thinkers, artists, and philosophers were solitary. Their insights didn't come from noise or constant conversation. They came from silence. Solitude becomes a kind of classroom where the lessons are written not on paper, but in moments of stillness. And it's in those quiet moments that emotional intelligence takes root. When you spend time reflecting, you learn to respond instead of react. You recognize when you're projecting, when you're being unfair, when you need to heal. That kind of awareness creates calm, empathy, and wisdom, traits that are hard to develop in the constant chaos of social life. A younger friend once told me she hated being alone because it made her think too much. But the truth is, that's exactly why solitude is so powerful. It forces you to confront yourself, not to punish, but to grow. Because no one can guide you towards self-awareness except you. Introspection turns loneliness into learning. It transforms silence into strength. It's what allows people who are often alone to remain balanced, thoughtful, and resilient even in difficult times. And from that depth of self-understanding emerges the final and perhaps most powerful trait: growth. Growth is what ties everything together. When you live authentically, stand independently, choose wisely, and reflect deeply, you inevitably evolve. You become someone who sees life differently, not from the surface, but from a higher perspective. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. It often comes from resistance, from learning to face discomfort instead of escaping it. The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote that resistance is an opportunity for virtue. And that's exactly what happens when a person spends long stretches of time alone. What others might call isolation becomes a training ground for strength, clarity, and maturity. It's like climbing a mountain. When you're up there, the air is thinner and the path is harder, but the view, the understanding you gain, is unlike anything in the valley below. People who live in solitude often see the world that way. They notice connections others miss. They develop patience, compassion, and gratitude for the smallest things. A man named Gregory once described it beautifully. After retiring early and moving to a quiet town by the sea, he said he finally understood the difference between existing and living. When I was younger, he said, I was surrounded by people, but I didn't really know myself. Now that I spend more time alone, I see things clearly. The colors of the sunset, the sound of the waves, even the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It's like I'm finally awake. That's what growth looks like. Awakening. It's realizing that solitude isn't a punishment. It's preparation. It's where wisdom matures, where emotional wounds heal, and where the spirit strengthens. People who walk that path tend to carry a quiet dignity. They don't rush. They don't compete. They don't envy. They understand that life is not a popularity contest, but a journey toward inner fulfillment. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is that it doesn't make them bitter or closed off. On the contrary, people who grow through solitude often become gentler. They stop judging others harshly because they understand how much everyone is struggling inside. They listen more, they react less, and they inspire others simply by being grounded. Their presence has a calming effect, the kind that makes you feel safe, even in silence. Because when someone has spent enough time alone, they stop needing to prove anything. Their peace speaks louder than their words, and that brings us back to where we started. The idea that not having many friends isn't a weakness. It can be a reflection of strength, wisdom, and growth. It means you've chosen quality over quantity, truth over popularity, and peace over noise. So if you're someone who sometimes wonders why your circle is small, take a deep breath and remind yourself. Perhaps it's not because you failed to connect, but because you've learned to connect more meaningfully. Maybe you're like Richard, who found peace in authenticity. Maybe like Emma, who discovered independence in solitude. Or like Clara, who learned to be selective with her heart. Maybe you found your reflection like Helen, or your wisdom like Gregory. Each of these people had fewer friends than most, yet each carried something far richer. Self-knowledge, balance, and a quiet kind of happiness that doesn't need to be seen to be real. In the end, people who don't have many friends often live deeper lives. They know that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. They've built a world inside themselves that's strong, calm, and full of meaning. So if this message resonates with you, if you recognize pieces of yourself in these stories, know this: you are not alone. You belong to a rare kind of soul who chooses consciousness over conformity. You've learned that your value isn't measured by how many people surround you, but by how deeply you know yourself. And that is something extraordinary.